He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Now, you've likely heard this famous aphorism by Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, it is legendary, right? But here's the thing. Most people totally miss the absolute genius of how these two sentences work together. They are completely inseparable. The first sentence, well, that's the ethical warning. But the second sentence? That isn't just some dramatic poetry. It is the exact psychological mechanism of how that warning becomes reality. It's a literal pipeline.
Welcome. In this explainer, we're going to take this incredibly abstract philosophical masterpiece and really ground it into a highly practical, modern-day reality about human attention. We are exploring the reciprocal gaze, Nietzsche's warning on moral metamorphosis. We're going to map out exactly how the human soul is actually transformed by the direction and the duration of its focus. Because honestly, this isn't just philosophy. This is the ordinary, everyday tragedy of how we become exactly what we behold.
Section 1. The Monster and the Abyss.
Okay, let's dive into this. To truly grasp what Nietzsche is warning us about here, we have to completely strip away those movie definitions of monsters. A monster, in Nietzsche's sense, isn't necessarily a violent criminal or some comic book villain. It is simply a fighter for whom ordinary moral categories have completely ceased to function as constraints. The monster just stops asking if an act is inherently good or evil. They really only ask one pragmatic question. Does this serve the fight? And because they believe their enemy is monstrous, suddenly, well, literally anything becomes permissible. They tell themselves it's just temporary, just defensive, just until victory. But victory never actually arrives in a final form, does it? And those extreme methods, they just become permanent habits.
Now, what about the abyss? The abyss is not a physical place. It's not hell, even if it certainly feels like it. It is a living, breathing relation. It is that which resists being looked at without looking back. Think about it like this. If you look at a stone, the stone remains entirely passive. It doesn't change you. But when you focus your intense attention on a form of negativity, something like cruelty, chaos, or systematic destruction, the whole relation inverts. To map the logic of deception, you have to temporarily think deceptively. To anticipate a cruel person, you kind of have to imagine cruelty. And that imaginative act, that is the very first thread pulling you into the abyss.
All right, section 2, how the gaze reverses.
Let's shift away from pure philosophy for a second and look at how this metamorphosis actually happens physically in the human brain. It starts with simulation. When you observe darkness, your brain's mirror neurons fire as if you were performing the act yourself. The brain really doesn't distinguish much between observing an action and preparing to perform it. Then, repeated simulation turns into rehearsal. And this rhythm is so absolutely crucial. Simulation becomes rehearsal, and rehearsal, sustained long enough, becomes disposition. Your actual character alters. It's not magic, folks. It's the slow sedimentation of repeated focus. We literally become what we repeatedly attend to. And this brilliantly illustrates the fundamental difference between old ways of thinking and Nietzsche's reality. The traditional Western philosophical view, think of big thinkers like Plato or Descartes, privilege the observer as this stable, autonomous fortress, completely untouched by whatever they were studying. But Nietzsche? He shatters this entirely. He argues for a continuous exchange. The boundary between the observer and the observed completely dissolves. You are not a fortress. To gaze into darkness is to essentially invite darkness into the very structure of your perception.
Which brings us to section 3, the abyss in everyday life.
So how does this actually play out outside of a textbook? Let's look at 3 distinct fighters and their original, totally noble goals. First, interrogators in the War on Terror. Their goal was to protect the nation. But by suspending rules to fight a monstrous enemy, a democracy founded on rejecting torture began operating secret prisons. They became the nation that tortures. Next up, therapists. They aim to treat severe trauma. But by holding stories of utter horror in their attention daily, they can develop vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. The abyss of another suffering gazes back at them. Finally, and we've probably all seen this one, online vigilantes. They start out with moral outrage to expose hatred, but over time they adopt their enemies' methods, doxing, harassment, mob cruelty. They become purveyors of the exact same harassment they sought to destroy. The hunter and the hunted literally exchanged faces.
History actually gives us a chillingly clear example of this arc during the French Revolution. The revolutionaries stormed the Bastille in 1789, speaking beautifully of liberty and equality. But within just 4 years, those exact same leaders were executing thousands during the Reign of Terror. Robespierre, a lawyer who once passionately opposed the death penalty, became the very architect of state terror. He didn't see himself as a tyrant, not at all. He saw himself as virtue purifying the nation. He'd gazed so intensely into the cruel privilege of the monarchy that he couldn't recognize his own cruelty. Ultimately, the monster wore his face. But you don't even need a human enemy for this to happen. Consider the example of the butcher and the sheer crushing weight of 10,000 repetitions of necessity. A young butcher might start out really feeling the weight of each kill, maybe even reciting a prayer with care and attention. But the work is relentless, dozens of animals a day. Over 10,000 repetitions, the initial shudder just fades away. The care diminishes. He didn't fight a monster, he just fought the brute necessity of taking life. But staring into that daily abyss of blood and mechanical slaughter, that makes cruelty an ordinary texture of a person's character.
Section 4, the illusion of immunity. So you might be wondering, why on earth don't these people notice they're changing? So the crucial point is, the abyss actually provides its own justification. Inside the abyss, monstrous methods do not announce themselves as evil. They don't wear a villain's cape and twirl a mustache. Instead, they announce themselves as realism, as necessity, as the hard truth that soft people just cannot accept. It gives the fighter a story about themselves that makes their own ongoing transformation completely invisible to them.
Think about the specific traps of self-justification we just covered. Torturers wholeheartedly believe they are extracting life-saving information. Corrupt undercover officers believe they are uniquely maintaining order in a broken system. Revolutionaries believe they are purifying the nation. And online vigilantes firmly believe they are delivering true justice. Consider this directly. Believing in your own immunity, thinking, oh, that wouldn't happen to me, that is the very first step toward monstrosity. No one is immune. The abyss absolutely does not discriminate. Section 5. How to resist the abyss. If literally no one is immune, how do you build safeguards against this incredible psychological gravity? Well, there are practical, institutional ways to break the gaze. First, strict legal boundaries that are never suspended, not even in emergencies. Second, independent accountability that actually punishes corruption rather than protecting it. Third, the forced rotation of personnel out of high-exposure roles. And fourth, rituals of return to the world of light, engaging in practices that have absolutely nothing to do with darkness. I gotta warn you though, where these safeguards are absent, the abyss simply consumes everything. Let's move to our next point and see how this builds into the ultimate philosophical resistance, which actually hinges on a single vital condition, the word long. Notice, Nietzsche didn't say the abyss always wins. He said if you gaze long into an abyss, it gazes back. That means you must consciously choose to look away before the gaze reverses. You can look, you can extract exactly what you need to understand the threat, and then you have to intentionally break the connection. You have to know when enough is enough. We're going to end this explainer with a final, provocative question for you to ponder. Will you recognize its eyes when they appear in your own reflection? And will you actually have the strength to turn away? Turning away is not running from reality, It is not cowardice. To break the repetition of darkness and actively choose the light is the highest form of courage required to remain human. Think deeply about what you are giving your attention to today. Thank you so much for exploring this with me, and remember, guard your gaze.